Norton, a Republican strategist and a former senior official at the Department of Homeland Security, who joins us from Washington, as you see. James, let's start with you in Washington. Some people like John McCain, admittedly people who are no fans of Donald Trump, have been invoking Watergate and wondering where this ends. Where do you think it will end?
Well, I think it's a little premature right now to be talking about impeachment. Impeachment is a pretty long, drawn-out process. In fact, there's only been 2 impeachments in the history of the United States. One, the most recent, was Bill Clinton, and the other one was Andrew Johnson following the death of Abraham Lincoln. So, you know, that's something that I think is a little far-fetched at this point. I think we're also a little at risk, these days in this 24-hour news cycle. You know, we hear a piece of information and it's tweeted and it's put on Facebook, and immediately we jump to conviction before the 24 hours is even to, step back a little bit, find out what the facts are, understand the full scope of the discussion before we kind of jump into an impeachment proceeding, which again I think is a little bit way down the road here, if anything at all actually occurred.
Yeah. Peter, James is surely right to urge caution here, because ultimately, if you look at this on an evidential basis, you've got somebody who's hurting, James Comey. He's been fired very publicly by the president, who is claiming he's got a contemporaneous note of a conversation he had with the president, including language which you could look at it, doesn't necessarily say what it obviously says. So, you know, it's he says, where's the truth?
Yes, indeed, Colin. I think I agree with James in terms of, I think it's a long way down the road in terms of impeachment, but Democrats and critics of the president have been keen to jump on that particular bandwagon. Week in terms of the Trump administration, we've had one twist in drama every single day. I think in terms of impeachment, if you recall, Bill Clinton, when he was impeached, it was on the grounds of perjury and obstruction of justice. I think what's coming out of here, the glimmering here, is this particular explosive note, whereby the FBI Director Comey has a memo, which of course as a senior leader, he would take a note, a transcript of the discussions he'd had, particularly with the President of the United States. And this often is an evidential basis. These kind of contemporaneous notes are submitted in terms of court hearings as evidence. But you're right, it will come down to an issue of trust. Do the American people trust the President of the United States or FBI Director Comey?
Peter, just to be clear, you evoke the memory of Clinton and impeachment. Are we saying here that it's obstruction, potentially? Is that the word that we're using?
I think it's about obstruction of justice going forward. I think there is the other parallel issue which is going on with regard to his meeting with the Russian Foreign Ministry and also the Russian ambassador, you will recall, which is now suggested that what President Trump had done is that as Commander-in-Chief, he didn't do anything illegal in terms of what he did, in terms of sharing whatever information may have come out. I think, but politically it could be damaging, well, particularly if it compromised.
Hold that thought, because in a sense that's scandal par deux, isn't it? James Norton, let's go back to you in Washington and reflect on what the atmosphere in the White House must be, in a sense, because it's got to be a pretty neurotic place. And I suppose if you are a supporter of Trump, you would say, look, this is crazy. You've got the most senior politician in the land who doubts his ability to speak frankly and confidentially with officials, pages of the New York Post, New York Times.
You know, I think it's important to remember that, the FBI director, as well as any other agency head in the federal government, works for the president, and they serve at the pleasure of the president, whoever that president is. And because of that, they also have the right to remove that person from office, at any point. And so Donald Trump, while this obstruction discussion might make it seem interesting, was certainly within his rights to remove the FBI director. And it was also something that Democrats were calling for very strongly after, Comey released his memo in October about Hillary Clinton reinvestigating her. So, there's definitely a little bit of a hypocrisy, I think, abound when it comes to James Comey. I think, your point on, how is the White House operating at this point? I think all White Houses have challenges in the early days of any administration. I think that, Bill Clinton's White House had a lot of trouble where we talked about him. They fired the White House Travel Office, was one of their first acts when he was president. And that caused quite a bit of a stir here in Washington. George Bush certainly had his challenges, and as well as Barack Obama. So I don't think it's an unusual. Certainly, again, I think we have to go back to this 24-hour news cycle and the social media and kind of the aggrandizing some of these things and not taking them in context. And I also would remind everyone that, you know, Donald Trump was essentially swept into office for the fact that the numbers in Washington, the ratings in Washington for Congress and other politicians, you know, continue to be at an all-time low. And while it might be, you know, important that we get the facts, it is important that an agenda also move forward, like health care, like tax reform, and those are the things that he was really swept into office.
Yeah. On that, Peter, I mean, might it be that in all, you know, the Beltway obsesses about this, the bubbles obsess about it, but actually in Middle America, it acts effectively as a kind of displacement activity because they'll see the brouhaha, they'll put it down to the usual media elites, and so long as Trump delivers on what matters to them, on the economy, on trade deals and migration, actually.
I think, though, there is a concern amongst Republicans and anxiety. I think Mitch McConnell put it quite well the other day when he said he would like a lot less drama from the White House because they're not going forward with a legislative agenda, and they're nervous about the midterm elections if this comes unstuck. And certainly the president is safe for now. He still has his core support behind him fully. If that begins to slip, though, I think then he would be in danger. Senior Republicans have been quite quiet. It just depends. Here on in, we're going to see demands for full disclosure of the Comey memo. You've got 5 standing committees in Congress. We're going to see the intelligence committees in the House and in the Senate looking at this, redoubling their efforts. The House Oversight Committee wants to look at the leaking of classified information, and the Judiciary Committee will want to look at the firing of Comey. And I think we will see Director Comey giving public testimony down the road.
James, can we just sort of ventilate this point about disclosure of documents? I remember working briefly in Washington about 10 years ago and talking to somebody there who was telling me about this practice whereby people on the Hill, fearful about documents being pulled or subpoenaed, would write stuff down on post-it notes because they knew they couldn't be. That didn't qualify as an official document. So you were getting reams and reams of notes appearing on post-it notes because they couldn't be pulled. And if you think about Hillary Clinton, part of her problem with emails was that she wanted to write stuff down, keep an accurate verbatim record without them necessarily being used against her at some future time. It becomes a problem.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, follow the money, follow the paper trail. It's always been kind of a cliche term, you know, in Washington when, you know, committees are doing investigations, you know, of any party, of any White House, they're going to look for memos and documents and those kind of things. So I don't think it's an unusual step. I think that, you know, if there is some information on paper that I'm sure it'll be supplied and whatever it is, it'll be allow people to make a broader decision process. You know, I think Democrats have been digging in their heels about wanting a special prosecutor, but I also think, you know, Barack Obama refused to appoint a special prosecutor when it came to Hillary Clinton and, you know, her email server at the State Department. So again, I think hypocrisy abounds, and it kind of goes back to the American people essentially not being happy with Washington and finding a way for it to become, you know, kind of stuck in the mud and not be able to move forward, you know, on an agenda. And I think that'll be really Donald Trump's challenge, you know, obviously dealing with this investigation, but, you know, is he able to move a legislative agenda and actually have some accomplishments for the midterms? I think we're on day 118 here, so it is still a little bit early. He does have the rest of the year here to, you know, get his health care plan in place, and then, you know, his budget, the first Trump budget, FY18, will be released in about 2 or 3 weeks, which will really give us an understanding of what his priorities will be in his new administration. You know, there was a budget a few weeks ago, but the reality is that was Barack Obama's budget that was failed to be passed by Congress 7 months later, which Donald Trump took a little bit of a hit on. So there's a lot actually to be done here. It'll be important for him to get control, you know, of the White House and of his staff, and to kind of move an agenda forward, work with Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell and others. And frankly, he's going to have to work with Chuck Schumer and the Democrats as well. And that'll be a pretty big trick for him to pull off if he can do it. But that's really what he's going to have to do.